The word taiva indicates a human need, a tzorech, which has in it the koyach of the ashpah of the Yetzer Hara, which means that as the person satisfies that need, he also satisfies certain aspects of gaiva, or the ability to believe in Yeshua ibn Vadoi. This is what the word taiva indicates. There are many human needs which are not taivas. For example, breathing. As we said before, breathing is a human need, just like eating. It's just as far as the body is concerned, the absorption of oxygen is just as important for metabolism as the absorption of food. There's no difference. Without oxygen, the body cannot burn energy. Just like without food, the body has no fuel. So as far as the body, as far as the physical process of metabolism or combustion is concerned, you see, oxygen is just as important as the combustion process as fuel. But it is the eating which is the taiva, not breathing. Breathing is neutral. It's a need, but it's neutral to the Yetzer Hara. There's no, if a person breathes, he doesn't feel like a Baal Gaiva because he breathes. And therefore it's not subject to a mitzvah. There's no lois that says thou shalt not breathe, or thou shalt breathe 4 times an hour or something like that. But eating, you see, is a drive which became involved with the Yetzer Hara. So therefore eating has with it hanor, which relates to aspects of gaiva. And as such, the Yetzer Hara can use this particular drive in the Bechira process to see whether or not a man wants to manifest himself in a Yeshua Mavada capacity and be a gaiva, or in an Einoid Mavada capacity and be an Anav. This is the essential mechanism of a chet. What do we see from this entire discussion? We begin to see certain fundamental principles. We first of all see the relationship of the Guf HaAdam to the Yetzer Hara, and we see where the Yetzer Hara connects to the Guf HaAdam in that kind of sense. And we see how the spashtus of the Satan determines fundamentally the number and the type of mitzvahs which are required in order to remove that spashtus. Now, in other words, the Torah itself, which is the instrument or the device which eradicates the Zoyama from the Bria and brings the Bria to its tikkun, in basic terms reflects the status of the Satan at any point in time. This is a very, very critical principle. And if we begin to examine throughout history a number of the critical points in history, we'll begin to see how this is reflected. Adam Rishon before the Chet fundamentally had one mitzvah. The mitzvah was Lo Seichal Min Ha'etz. That was his mitzvah. Why was his mitzvah? That was the mitzvah for the basic reason that the Yetzer Hara was involved in the Ma'aseh Achila as regards the Eitz Hadas. So therefore, since the Yetzer Hara, the koyach of the ashpah of the Satan, lay in the act of eating towards this particular tree, there was a corresponding mitzvah that says, don't eat of it. One is a gilu in the other. One is a direct reflection of the other. The mitzvah is megala where the Yetzer Hara resides. The tachlis of Adam Rishon, by keeping that first mitzvah, was to bring down the uris, or the ashpah, min hashemayim, into his neshama, and mizdaya his neshama, and therefore mizachach his guf, and the entire bria. So therefore his function was to bring down the uris and lift up the entire bria from a madreg of chason to a madreg of shlemus. There was no kilkul yet at that point. So fundamentally, if Adam would have succeeded, he would have been mazach the bria. He would have taken the bria out of a level of chason into a level of zichuk or kedusha. Now, if that would have happened, he would have removed the nachash or the satan. If Adam had succeeded, what would have happened to the satan? What would have happened is the satan would have been removed from the bria. The entire pitoy or seduction of the Yetzer Hara would have been cancelled. Because once the bria, the only way the nachash or the Yetzer Hara can function is when the world is in the level of chasan. You see, when there's a certain hester. But if you take the world, right, and you suddenly bring it to a level of shlemus, where the zichoch and ruchnis is all evident, there's gilu yechudah, right? There is no nachash anymore, there's no Yetzer Hara. They cannot survive. The Satan cannot survive in such a world. He has no feet, he has no reglayim. So therefore, the elevation of the world from a level of chason to a level of kedusha, of shlemus. You see, by bringing down, by being mekadosh the world, fundamentally removes automatically the Satan, and therefore automatically the Nachash, who's the representation of the Satan in the Bria. You see, therefore the first mitzvah that Adam was given was fundamentally the Torah at that time. The Torah at that time was in that one mitzvah, and that one mitzvah was megala the fact that the Yetzer Hara resided in the Ma'aseh Achila for the Yetzer Das. If Adam would have been mekayim that lo say, he would have been masakin the Bria, and therefore he would have been masakin the Nachash by removing him. That's why the Torah at the time of Adam Rishon, which was in the form of one mitzvah, is called the Torah Betikan HaNachash. That's what it is. That was the form of the Torah. The function of the Torah at that time was to masakin the Nachash. Why? Because fundamentally, all that existed the Adam Rishon before the Chet was the Nachash itself. You see, there was no kilkul, there was no zoyamah yet in the Bria. So Adam was involved with the Torah, whose specific objective was to masakin the Nachash. He only needed one mitzvah for that, and it was a loiseh say. So the Torah of Adam Rishon was fundamentally the Torah B'tikkun HaNachash. That was its Torah, because that's where the Ra was. That's where the Yetzer Hara was. After the Chet of Adam Rishon, there was a big kilkul that entered the Bria, and there was a Zoyamah and a kilkul that entered the Bria, which means that there was a hispashtus of the Satan. Now, where do we fundamentally see this hispashtus? The Satan, first of all, came into the growth. It came into the Bria, into the substance of the Bria. So Adam was no longer able to be mezach the Bria, to mekadosh the Bria, because of the kilkul. And we explained this many times before. This introduced a whole new process of tikkun called the Mashiach ben Yosef. But Adam Rishon, after the Chet, experienced a hispashtus in the Zoyamah, in his body, in the Bria, and also in the various different activities or areas of human experience, which means that there were now more mitzvahs. And there were 7 mitzvahs now. Where there used to be 1, there were now 7. And Noach fundamentally brought these, that's what they call Shemus B'nai Noach. Although I believe that Adam already was aware of this, but they were formalized in Noach's time, basically. Although I believe that even Adam Rishon and Eved already began to deal with the 7 mitzvahs. But what used to be 1 mitzvah was now 7 mitzvahs. There were now 7 areas of human experience in which the Yetzer Hara infiltrated or resided in. So, because of that, there were now 7 mitzvahs that had to remove that. Well, now the Torah at that time was in the form of 7 mitzvahs. So the Torah at that time now is mostly it will become involved in the masakin, the Zoyamah, you see, as well as the Nachash. That means that the Torah of Noach, until the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, was fundamentally concerned with the tikkun of Zoyamah and the tikkun of Nachash as well. The tikkun of Nachash was not lost. The Torah always kept up the fact that it always attempted to deal with the tikkun of the Nachash, to remove the Nachash from the Bria. But now its fundamental form, or tzura, was primarily concerned with the tikkun of the Zoyamah, or the kilkul. You see, the tikkun of the hispashtus of the Yetzer Hara into many, many new areas. So that the Torah of Noach reflected the level of Satan in the Bria at that time. But here, for the first time, by the time of Noach, or Adam Rishon after the Chet, so we see that the Torah changed Surah, in a sense that its fundamental tachlis was to masakin the Zoyamah as well as the Nachash. So we say that the Torah of Noach, or the Shemus B'nai Noach, was a Torah B'tikkun HaZoyamah. That was its major emphasis. But it still retained the properties of B'tikkun HaNachash. You see. And here we see the corroboration of the fundamental principle we said before, that even though Adam did not do the process of Mashiach ben David, and the new process of Mashiach ben Yosef came in, you see, later on, as the Mashiach ben Yosef process became the predominant one to deal with the kilkul, the Mashiach ben David process still remained also. And that process also takes place. So since the Chet of Adam Rishon, there is both tikkun of the kilkul and tikkun of the chason, both taking place, both being reflected by the new tzura of the Torah, which is the Shivmitz B'nai Noach. In the time of Adam before the Chet, the two of the Torah was only the tikkun of the Nachash, which is the tikkun of the Chesson of the Bria. After the Chet of Adam Rishon, it was the tikkun of not only the Chesson of the Bria, but the tikkun also of the Zorim or the Kilkul of the Bria. So therefore the Torah was in the form of 7 mitzvahs to be able to establish those tikkunim. The next time we find is by the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. Even though by the time of Noach there were 7 mitzvahs, and therefore the sparshness of the Satan was in 7 areas, but the truth of the matter is, as the generations got worse and worse, it began to mispash it in 613 areas. That's why Avon began to keep the Taryag mitzvahs. However, these 613 Taryag areas were not formalized or finalized until Matan Torah. At that point already, the Sitra Achra had been mispashed in 613 areas of human experience. And because of that, you need Taryag mitzvahs to be masaken the entire situation. Now, here's an important thing. And here's what we have to take into account. Matan Torah, fundamentally, as we've said many times, was really supposed to be the Gula Shlema. You see. So the question is, if it was supposed to be the Gula Shlema, what is the function of doing Taryag mitzvahs? Moshe went up to the Har and was Megala Taryag mitzvahs. The Ratzon HaBorah, the Torah, which is Petzuas Taryag. Okay. Now, the Torah Petzuas Taryag, was that a tikkun of the Nachash or tikkun of the Zohar? We all know, Chazal say that at Matan Torah, Poskel Zomosam, that the Zohar of the original Nachash, the Chet of Adam Rishon, left. So if the Zohar was nifsak and left, so therefore, what is the function therefore of the Taryag? In that sense, you see, for the Tikkun Nachash, possibly, but the two is more than the Tikkun Nachash. The fact that it's the essays and Moshe say means that it would seem to be much wide. And what I would basically feel is true is that it was still a Tikkun for Zohar, but it was the last Tikkun of Zohar. When the Jews got to Matan Torah, what happened was the Zohar was nifsak. The word nifsak means severed. It doesn't mean left. It means it simply was cut, severed. Nifsak HaChevel, the rope was split. So what happened was, by the time Matan Torah had been achieved, with the 210 years in the Mitzrayim, the Shibud of Mitzrayim, because of all that Yisurin, the Jews had successfully been massacred all the Tumah which was in the Bria from that time, from the time of Adam Rishon till that time. And what they effectively did was, they cut, or they severed the connection of the Satan to the Neshamas, or to the Bria. But they didn't remove the Zohar. The Zohar still remained as a surface covering. In other words, it did not actually leave them yet, the Zohar. Its attachment, its devekis, its connection to the Bria was cut. You see, it was simply merely a matter of throwing it off. The emotion I can give to that, for example, if a man is in prison and he's in a cell, right? And the cell door is locked. The man goes over and tries to open the door, he can't because it's locked. You see, that's the situation where the Satan is dovuk to the Bria. When the Zohar is connected to the Bria itself. The person can't get rid of it, in that sense. However, let's say, for example, the guard comes over and opens the door. He unlocks the key, but he doesn't open the door. You see, is the man free? Well, technically he's not, because technically the door is still closed. However, it simply remains a matter for the man to come over and simply push the door open. But he has to push the door open. And I believe that this was the status of Klal Yisrael at Matan Torah. The status of Klal Yisrael at Matan Torah was that the Zohar, the Kilkul of Adam Rishon, the Kilkul of all the people at that time in the Bria, was nifsak. It was cut off. There was no more influence or hashpor that the Satan really had as a Zohar in the Bria. The Kilkul was Mesukkan. However, the Kilkul was not removed. In order to remove it, the Klal Yisrael would yet have to do the Taryag mitzvahs. But if they did the Taryag mitzvahs for a very short period of time, maybe once or twice, as soon as they did it, suddenly the Zohar would have been completely removed. And the world actually would have been elevated to the state of Adam Rishon before the Chet, where the Zohar was actually out of the substance of the Bria itself. So that was the function of the Taryag. The function of the Taryag, or the function of the Torah, the Tzur of the Torah that Moshe was Megala, was to be Masakin, the Zohar of the Bria, the last of the Zohar of the Bria. And in addition also to be Masakin the Nachash, or to remove the Satan from the Bria completely. This is what the Tzura of Moshe the Tayag that he brought down. The Tayag that Moshe brought down, which was the first Luchas, had the Koyach to completely remove the Zoyama and to be Mesach in the Nachash as well. Because it reflected, the Torah that he brought down the first time, the first Luchas, reflected the Tikkun that the Bria needed, and it reflected the essential residence of where the Satan was, all in one. However, Klal Yisrael reintroduced the Zoyama by the Chet of the Egel. You see. So Moshe had to go up and bring down another Luchas. You see. The Luchas that he went up and brought down was already a new kind of Luchas. It was a different form of Torah in a sense. Because that Torah now had to be in the form where it had to again Mesaken the Zoyama, full force. But this time it was the Zoyama of the Nachash. That has to be, it was the Zoyama of the Egel. It was the Chet of the Egel that we're dealing with. The Chet of Adam Rishon fundamentally was Kamat Mesukin already. The after effects of the Kilkel of Adam Rishon are fundamentally gone from the Bria, really. They're still here, because the Kilkel of Adam Rishon was reintroduced with the Kilkel of the Egel. But it is the Egel in which we are now dealing with. That's why, and I will cover it later on, the Mashiach ben Yosef fundamentally is constantly in battle with the Zoyama as it emanates from this Egel, not from the Zoyama that emanates from Adam Rishon. That's why the main battle of the Mashiach ben Yosef is against the Erev Vav. Because the Erev Vav were the ones who were most responsible for the Egel itself. But we went into that, we'll go into that a little bit later on. So fundamentally we see that Moshe was Megala two different Torahs. The first Torah that was Megala was a Torah that was much higher, much greater. You see, it's Tikkun. It had much less of a job. Therefore, the Torah that he was Megala the first time was much more b'shlemus. It was much more ruchniistic, because it had less of a tikkun to do. It only had to be Mesach in the Nachash and simply lift off the Zoyama. But after Klal Yisrael did the Chet of the Egel, then the Torah that came down the second time was the Shiva, the second Luchas that Moshe brought, already was a Torah that had to deal with the full force of Zoyama, just like the Shiva Mitzvahs had to deal with the full force of the Zoyama of Adam Rishon, the Chet of Adam Rishon, the Chet of the Eitzadas, the Torah, the second Torah of Moshe, the second Luchas, had to deal with the intense Zoyama which now existed in the Bria because of the Egel, as well as the Tikkun of the Nachash itself. The function of the first Luchas that Moshe brought down was basically simply to remove the last residue of the Zoyama and to be Mesaken the Nachash. But that Torah would have been the Torah of the Moshe Mashiach at that time had it occurred. Because Moshe was the Mashiach ben Yosef, and he would have brought Klal Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael, and the Moshe Mashiach would have started. And the Moshe Mashiach would have started with the Torah of Taryag Mitzvahs at that time. That was the kind of Torah which was necessary to Mesaken the Nachash at that time. You see, since the Moshe Mashiach did not materialize at that time, but it came later on, therefore the Torah, the Tzur of the Torah, which is needed to Mesaken the world in the last Moshe Mashiach, will be different than the one which Moshe Rabbeinu needed. The Luchas that Moshe Rabbeinu brought down the first time were fundamentally the Tikkun of the Chasson of the Bria, because the world, the Klal Yisrael, the Bria had gone to a Madrega of Kamat Adam Rishon for the Chet. Hence the Torah that Moshe brought down the first time around was mostly concerned with the Tikkun of the Nachash, or the Tikkun of the Chasson of the Bria. But after the Chet of the Egel, then the Torah that Moshe was Megala was mostly concerned with the tikkun of the kilkel, you see, to bring the bria from a level of kilkel to a level of chassan. So therefore, it dealt with the tikkun of the zoyim of the nachash in that sense. And there are distinct differences between the two. However, the Torah, the two of the Torah which the world will have at the Yom Mashiach, should it occur at the time of the Ikvus Mashiach by the Kates, will be different than the Torah which Moshe was Megal at the first point in time. And we'll speak about that in a minute. Now, we basically are right now living in the two of the Torah, which Moshe was Megal the second time, which means that the essence of the Taryag Mitzvahs now essentially are primarily concerned with being Mesaken the Zoyama of the Chet of the Egel, and being Mesaken also the Nachash, which was the original tikkun of the Torah itself. However, since the Golus is very long, and and that Torah goes on, and as we said before, that if the Yemos Mashiach appears close to the gates, we said that the Yemos Mashiach will be greater than the Yemos Mashiach would have been had it occurred before. If you recall, that's because once the Yemos Mashiach appears by the gates, which means towards the end of the 6,000 years, not only will the Zoma have been completely removed, which is the Zoma of Adam Rishon and the Zoma of the Egel, but the Nachash will also have been Mesukan to a large degree. You see, that means that La'osad Lavoy, the Torah which will be Magala by the Mashiach ben Yosef, La'osad Lavoy, fundamentally is different than the Torah which Moshe Rabbeinu was Magala, even the first time around, in the sense that it will be much more Muslim. Why? Because it will have less of a job to do. Because the tikkun of the Nachash will have already occurred over the thousands of years that it took to get to the end by the gates. So fundamentally we see this idea that the longer it takes for the world to get to the Madreg of Yemos Mashiach, the higher that Yemos Mashiach will be when it arrives. And thus, the more Muslim the Torah will be when it arrives. And therefore, Tzur will not be the same as before. That's fundamentally the relationship, the proportional relationship. The Tzur of the Torah is directly proportional to the amount of Zoyama in the Bria. But the Tzur of the Torah is also proportional to the amount of Satan that's in the Bria. Not only Zoyama, but the amount of Satan that's in the Bria as well. So therefore, as the world goes on, and the Zoyama is more and more Masukan, the Nachash is also more and more Masukan. So that by the time that the last Yemos Mashiach arrives, which is very close to the end of Olam Hazeh completely, not only will the Zoyamo will have been completely Mesukah, the Kilkul, you see, but even the Nachash will have gone through a tremendous amount of tikkun. So therefore the Torah which will appear in that time will be much higher in its urus than the Torah which Moshe was Megala, even the first time that he was out by the Luchas. What will the Torah be like in the end, which Mashiach ben Yosef will be Megala in the Yemos Mashiach itself? Well, fundamentally we understand what that Torah is like. Because that Torah will obviously be different than the Torah of today, in some way, because the Zoyama will be gone. The Zoyama of both Adam Rishon and the Zoyama of the Egel will be completely gone. So obviously, the mitzvahs at that time will not have to deal with Zoyama anymore. They will not be involved in being the sakin, the kilkul of Zoyama. In addition, the amount of Nachash or something which remains in the Bria will also be very small. Much smaller than the Nachash which exists in the time of Adam Rishon Kodim Ached. So therefore we see that the Torah itself will be very different. How will it be different? That's difficult to say. But if one understood the tikkun of each mitzvah and what it does, one can actually understand what the mitzvahs will look like in the Yemos Mashiach. We will not explore this particular line. It's much too difficult at this point. From everything we've said, there emanates a fundamental principle from everything that we've said. We see that throughout history there are various different critical periods, and the various different periods of history indicate that as man does more and more sin, the Zoyama or the Kilkul becomes greater and greater. Hence the Torah begins to change its Tzura in order to deal with the spashness of the Tumah into the Bria and into more and more areas of human experience. Thus, there is a proliferation of mitzvahs from 1 to 7 to 613 to deal with the constant expansion of the Tumah of the Satan into the Bria. From this understanding, we begin to basically know the fundamental definition of what the Mashiach ben Yosef is. Because the Mashiach ben Yosef basically was Adam, well not Adam, but basically it was Noach, it was Moshe, and it's the Mashiach ben Yosef at the end. And fundamentally, what their tachlis is to be Magala, the Tzur of the Torah, which is necessary to Matzaken, the Kilkul and the Chason, which exist at that time. That is the basic definition of the Mashiach ben Yosef. That is his soul, and that is his major and primary task. Noach was Megala, the 7 mitzvahs, which were necessary at that time to be Matzaken the Zoyama at that period. Moshe was Megala, the Taryag mitzvahs, which were Matzaken the Chason, the Kilkul of the Bria at that time. And fundamentally, the Mashiach ben Yosef is then, he will be Megala the Torah, which is then necessary, Lasad Lavoy, to finally masakin completely the union of Nachash entirely. That then is basically the union of Mashiach ben Yosef. The Mashiach ben Yosef is the individual who serves as the conduit for the Or HaTorah, which is appropriate for that point in time. He is Megala, the particular tzura which is appropriate at that time. And what determines the appropriateness of the tzura of Torah at any time depends on the kind of tikkun in which that tzura of Torah must establish. And the individual who's Megala that tzura to that particular generation is called, by general definition, the Mashiach ben Yosef. That's why the Mashiach ben Yosef also Lovoi will have many, many similarities to Moshe, in the sense that both will be involved in the Megala, a certain level of Torah min Shemayim that had not preceded before. When I say that the truth of the Torah changes, the essence, the Or Torah always remains the same. And we'll understand this in a minute. What changes is the way the Torah is shaped in order to masaken the various kekulim chasroim that exist. But the pnimis of the Torah always remains the same. And how do we know this? We know this in the following way. What is the fundamental hatova of mankind? Olam haba. How will mankind achieve the hatova of Olam haba? How will he achieve it? Through hasagas yichudai. But where was he going to get this hasagas yichudai? Through the Torah. In other words, there is another tzura of the Torah which has never appeared yet, and that tzura is the tzura in Olam Haba. You see, it is the way the Torah will look like in Olam Haba, and men will learn that Torah, and through the learning of that Torah, they will be Masi Yechudai, and that's the Nene Mezdiva Shechina in Olam Haba. So the fundamental vehicle or device which will give the Hatov of the Olam Haba is itself the Torah. So we begin to understand many, many things about the Torah. But in that time, what will be the tzur of that time? Well, first of all, the tzur of that time will be very different than in Olam Hazeh. What the Torah of Adam, Noach, Moshe, and the Mashiach ben Yosef all have in common is that this Torah all has the union of Olam Hazeh. But fundamentally, the Torah in Olam Hazeh always has the job of tikkun. It always has to be masaken. Either it's masaken the Nachas, the Satan, or it's masaken the Kilko. But it's always in the process of tikkun, which means that the Torah at that point in time is in a form of a device which always raises the world from a level of Yerida to a level of Aliyah. But in Olam Haba, this will not be true. The Torah at that time will be a perfect Torah in the sense that it will be B'Shlei Musai. Just like the world, men will be B'Shlei Musai, and all men, and the Bria will be in a Madreg of Shlemus. The Torah will also be a Madreg of Shlemus, which means that the oil will be Magal at that point in time will not be in the form of mitzvahs. It will not be in the form of Tayag mitzvahs, obviously, because there's no necessity to be masakin anything through specifically areas of human activity. It will be in another form. You see, that form is its ultimate pnimius. That's what always remains the same. When we say Lo Yom Dotzai, that the Baruch will never change the Torah, obviously the Torah that we're talking about is the pnimius Torah, which is the essential all of the Torah itself. That is and will always be the same, because that all, which is the all of the pnimius Torah, is the light which is Betzuas, which when that Tzur is Megal the Yichud of the Baruch Shalom.
Means we'll have a greater Havana, a greater Asogah eventually.
The Tzur of the Torah in Olam Haba is what's called the Torah Betzuas HaYichud. Because in Olam Haba, that light will clearly show Yichud without any speakers or anything. And will show many, many madrigas of Yichud. The light will be a pure light, that from that light, in those Hasogas, we will see the absolute Yichud HaBorei. And from the Hasogas Yichud that we see from the Baruch Shalom, we will be Nene Miziv Shechina. That's the Hatova of, of the Bria. But the Torah in Olam Hazeh is not concerned, you see, with revealing us the Yichud. It is concerned with establishing the Yichud. That's the difference. The Torah in Olam Hazeh, which is the Torah of Adam, of Noach, of Moshe, and even the Torah of the Moshe Mashiach, is fundamentally a Torah where the light is clothed in certain manner, in certain type of tzura or certain form, but it's clothed in that form, and the function of that form is to assist man to be Magal Yechudai. The Torah at that point will be a device which will allow man to be Magal Yechudai, or to establish the Yichud. You see, that's the function. That's what we mean by the Tikkun. The Torah allows man to be Mesak in the Bria because it gives man the ability to be Magal Yechudai in the Bria versus Hesti Yechudai in the Bria. The Torah is a tool, it's an instrument, it's a device which focuses on Hasagas Yechudai and enables man to attempt to be Magal Yechudai, constantly against the Satan. But in Olam Haba, the Torah is not concerned with man being Magal Yechudai. It's not concerned with establishing a Gilu Yichud, you see, against the Hesti Yichud. Not at all, because it's B'Shleimus already. The Torah at that point in time is only concerned with showing that Yichud, making us aware what that Yichud is. But it's not involved in any Nisayan. It's involved with the finished product of Yichud. You see, it's involved with the Gili Yichud in its ultimate and final stage. The simple and ecstatic activity of being Master Yichud. Constantly. There's no Shtadlus. So therefore, that's the fundamental difference between the Torah in Olam Hazeh and the Torah in Olam Haba. The Torah in Olam Hazeh is an instrument for Shtadlus to be Mishtadl to be Megal Yichud. In Olam Haba, the all of the Torah is not a Shtadlus, but the all of the Torah in Olam Haba is simply to put us in a situation where we can be Megal Yichud as a direct awareness or a direct experience without any Shtadlus at all. That's the meaning of Schar. So fundamentally what we see is that the Or Torah in Olam Hazeh and Or Torah in Olam Haba is the same. The Or Torah is always concerned and always rests on the binyan of Gilu Yechudai. Always. The light of Torah is always the light which is Magal Yechudai. Always. That's the essence of Torah. Through the light of Torah, the Gilu Yichud of the Baruch Shalom is manifest. Except that in Olam Hazeh, the Torah is in a form or in a tzur which allows man to be mashtadl in that direction. In Olam Haba, the Torah is in a form which allows man to be neheneh from that direction. Man enjoys or is neheneh from the Hasagas Yechudai. Over here, he's mishtadl to be Master Yechudai. But the old Torah never changed. The tzur changed. So by looking at it this way, we begin to see a pattern or continuity to the entire history of men, from Adam Rishon until the end of the world of Yemos Mashiach. That basically, all periods of history are nothing more than specific aspects or specific states of the relationship of the Yetzer Hara, you see, of the Tumah to the Bria, and the kind of Torah which is required to masakin that state of Tumah or Yetzer Hara. That's basically what it is. Other mission the Bria only had the Nachash, which means the Bria was only involved with the Chason. So the Torah at that time dealt with the Tikkun of the Nachash or the Tikkun of the Chason to eradicate the Nachash from the Bria or the Satan from the Bria completely, not as Tumah, to eradicate its very presence from all existence for all time and bring the level of Olam Haba. Other mission after the Chet, which was by Noach, was involved already dealing with the presence of the Nachash in the Bria itself. Not only in terms of its hashpah, but in terms of its actual residence. In other mission only the hashpah of the Nachash was in the Bria, not as Tumah. In other mission after the Chet, the hashpah of the Satan was in the Bria, and this very substance was in the Bria as well. So the Torah that was involved then was involved in getting rid of the Zomar as well as getting rid of the Nachash. Later on by Moshe Rabbeinu, the Bria almost achieved the point of getting rid of almost all the Zomar. So Moshe was Megala Torah that would get rid of the last piece of Zomar, would just simply to take it off, and also massacre the rest of the Nachash in the Yemos Mashiach that should have been sued at that time. The Egel restored the entire Zomar back, so therefore the second Nuchas were involved again with Zomar itself. And finally, the Yemos Mashiach, by the time of the Mashiach, by the case, were involved with the same thing. With the Mashiach ben Yosef, again is Megala the two of the Torah, which is necessary to lift off the last Zomar of the Egel, again Paschalim Zohar Masun, and therefore he has to be Megala the Torah, which can lift off the last aspect of the Torah of the Egel, and also begin to deal with the last aspect of the Nachash or the Yetzer and the Bria. So that by the time that the end of the year 6000 arrives, everything would have been Mesukin. Both the Zoyamor, that would definitely have been gone even before, but finally by the year 6000, everything would have been removed. Even the Satan. There will no longer be a Satan. There will not be a Yetzer Hara. There will be no Hashpor. Forget about Tumah. Tumah will Zichur be removed from the Bria. But there will not even be a Yetzer Hara or a Hashpor in the Bria of the Yetzer Hara, in that sense. So therefore, finally, once this happens, the entire clip of the world will be completely destroyed and completely gone. Like Moshe said to Klal Yisrael, "Kasherisam asam hayom lo yisosifnu lo asam ad olam." In the time of at the end of the year 6000, we will never again see the Satan or any vestige of the Satan or any vestige of a Yetzer Hara. It will be all gone. And once that happens, then the Torah will be freed. The light of Torah will be freed. You see, so that it will be able to be Magali Yechudoi perfectly. Until the time of Olam Haba, the light of Torah cannot be Magali Yechudoi perfectly. It has to do it in different ways. It has to do it through different types of devices, through mitzvahs, you see, and allow men to be Magali Yechudoi. It itself cannot reveal this, because the Pnimis will not be open, because it will be constantly under a state of either Chasson. The Torah itself will either be in a Tzura, where it has the Masak and the Nachash, so the Torah itself is in a level of Chasson, or it's in a level of Kilkul, you see. What is very important to understand is that just like men suffer Chasson and men suffer Kilkul, the Torah also suffers Chasson and the Torah also suffers Kilkul. That its light is affected, the Torah is affected, you see, by the status of the Bria, if it's in the state of Chasson or Kilkul. But no matter what the situation is, the fact that Olam Hazeh is a state of Chasson, even if there is no Kilkul, means that the light of Torah is Mechusa in Olam Hazeh. In Olam Haba, the light of the Torah will be Mushlam. And that Torah will be a Torah which will no longer be in the Tzur of Tayag mitzvahs, or in the Tzur of any mitzvahs. It will be a different light which is Magali Yechudoi openly, and men will be able to be Mahana from this light, without any Ishtadlus at all. And that fundamentally is the Tzur of Olam Haba itself. I'd like to continue on the union of the Yemos Mashiach itself, the characteristics of the Yemos Mashiach. However, before we can go into the next union of the Yemos Mashiach, we have to have certain Hagdamas. We have been very explicit, and we've explained basically the union of the Torah as it transmutes Talat Olam Hazeh. And as we've said clearly, that the function of the Torah in Olam Hazeh, in this world, which is the Mokum, the Matzah of Ishtadlus, is a function of Tikkun. It comes to Masakin. However, it's the nature of the Tikkun, the Machus, or the essence of the Tikkun itself, depends on the Tzur, or the nature of the Satan himself, in terms of how he relates to the Bria. The greater that the Satan has Shaykhis or interacts with the Bria, then that forces a transmutation of the Chitzonis of the Torah in terms of its format to deal with that kind of hispashtus or tiburis, and therefore its Tzura changes. As we said, Ba'adam, the hispashtus of the Satan was very small, so 1 mitzvah was necessary. By Noach, 7 mitzvahs were necessary. By Moshe already, Tayag mitzvahs, and then finally we go on till the time of the Mashiach ben Yosef. But in each case there is an enlargement of the format of the Torah in terms of its ability to masakin the amount of interaction that the Satan has with the Bria itself. But of course, in Olam Haba, the function of Torah will not be for Tikkun, it will be for Hanor. And in that case, in that surah, in that sense, it will be openly Magali Yechudoi, so that people will be able to Mahana, to Masig Yechudoi directly. Now, to go on further in Yemos Mashiach, we will again go on into the Torah more specifically. And what we really like to examine today is more specifically what is the Torah, or what will the Torah look like that will be Megala by the time of the Iksus Mashiach. If Yemos Mashiach appears towards near the case, you see, so that Iksus Mashiach represents a door which is very, very bad, Kulu Chayavim. If that's what we're holding, where it's Kulu Chayavim, what is going to be fundamentally the nature of the Torah at that time. To what extent can we understand that? And what will be involved in terms of the Tzura at that time. But in order to understand this, we have to just explore another more fundamental concept. And that concept is called the Gilu level, or the Gilu Madrega. Now, whether you've noticed it or not, when you look at all of human history, you will notice a certain kind of movement regarding certain specific kinds of aspects or characteristics. In the beginning of the world, in the time of Adam, which is different, but Adam in the time of Noach, in the time of Noah Flogo, in the time of Avram, and the Ovus, and the Mitzrayim, and the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, Yetzias Mitzrayim, and then the Shoftim, and then the Melochim, and so on, up to Anshe Knesset Gdola. You'll notice certain very interesting characteristics that existed. And after the Anshe Knesset Gdola, specifically after the Mice of Purim, certain things changed very radically, and they never appeared again. Before the Anshe Knesset Gdola and the Mice of Purim, what we saw was clearly the existence of Nevuah, or prophecy. Now, what basically is Nevuah? Very simply put. Nevuah is a specific kind of madrega that a person achieves. It's a madrega of neshama, therefore it's a madrega of awe. If you have a person who's over the bonisham a tremendous amount, and he's to a very high form of dvekas, what happens is, there comes a point when suddenly he's over to a madrega of dvekas, or attachment to the bonisham, which is beyond normal teva. His ability to experience the bonisham is so great that technically speaking, it really goes beyond, it transcends the bounds of the body itself. That's why all Nevi'im had to fall asleep. Because of the vekas, or the perception that the neshama had, the experience that the neshama had of the bonisham was so profound that normally it would kill a person. A person cannot live and have that kind of vekas. But Nevuah was a certain gift to Klal Yisrael, a gift that he gave, that a person can experience the most profound madrega of dvekas, or awareness of the bonisham while he's yet in the guf. However, with all Nevi'im, they couldn't tolerate it while they were awake in consciousness. They had to sleep in a tardema. And what happens is as they're sleeping, they're experiencing a madrega of tremendous ecstasy, but it's in their sleep. Now, while this is going on, this dvekas, as they're being dovek to the bonisham, how are they being dovek to the bonisham? We have said this a number of times, and later on we will go into this much more in detail. The way a Navi is able to operate is because he has a different neshama than everyone else. The ability of a person to understand what goes on in the Yoinim, in the Shemayim, or to really more fundamentally connect with Ruchnius, or be sensitive to emes, depends on how high his neshama is. When a person is over the Bnei Shalom, as he's over it, what happens is greater and greater levels of neshama come down and attach itself to his neshama. And he doesn't know that directly. He can't experience neshama directly. However, what he can experience is a sudden awareness or sensitivity to ruchnis in which he didn't have before. He doesn't feel the neshama coming in, but he feels as if his mind was becoming larger. That his ability to comprehend or understand emes and ruchnis is suddenly much more vast and profounder than it was before. That's what happens when a new neshama comes down. We will go into this later on. But what happens by a Navi, because he reaches a very high madrega of dvekas, ordinarily, suddenly there comes down to him a certain neshama, which gives him the ability so that his entire consciousness explodes with ruchnius, to such an extent that he cannot be awake at that point. He falls into a deep sleep. Now, while he's being dovek to the bonisham, through that neshama, through that ha'ora, what happens is, he begins to see and understand things that have to do with that madrega. The chokhmah, or the da'at that exists in those worlds, suddenly is conducted down to his level, where he begins to see it. But he doesn't see it through thought, he sees it through mareh, through the imaginative faculty, which is the ability to produce visual input by closing the eyes. It's the ability to reproduce visual imagery, even if the eyes are closed. It's called the imaginative faculty. And what happens is that while the Navi is sleeping, that neshama suddenly begins to agitate the imaginative faculty. And through the symbolism which comes through mareh or through vision, through visual symbols, he begins to see tremendous chokhmah. Now, Nevi'us is a very high madrega, obviously, because it gives the person the ability to know things that are not possible to know otherwise. A person cannot know these things through chokhmah. Normal logic is inferential. You understand certain premises, and through these premises you can figure out other things. But Nevuah has no shaykh to inference, it has no shaykh to logic. You know things that cannot be known through the normal tivistic mind. You know things, for example, which are beyond reasoning. You know things which are beyond the prima facie evidence which is in front of you. You know things about the future. You know things about matters that are thousands of miles away. You see, things that cannot be known through normal logical or sensory processes. And you know them with an absolute certainty. Now what has to be understood is fundamentally, Nevi'us is really a process of devekis. It's a process of experiential connection to the God. It is not a process of das. Directly. Indirectly it is a process of das. When the Navi is mizdabik, as he's mizdabik to the Baruch Shalom, das comes to him through that devekis. But fundamentally Nevi'us is a process of devekis. And it is devekis which brings in it the das. You see, the mareh. It's important to know this, because this is very different which exists in what's called Ruach HaKodesh. And we'll explain this later on. In any case, obviously, the Baruch Shalom gave a gift to Klal Yisrael, to the Mininushi, of the concept of becoming a Navi, which means that he gave men the ability to become done with them in a very extremely profound way, and to know things which are beyond the normal conceptual activity of the human brain. This is called Nevuah. Hence, men can come to an absolute certainty about Ruchnius, about the existence of Ruchnius and the Baruch Shalom, and understanding many things, chokhmas, many understandings, ideas and das about Ruchnius and about the things in this world itself. Now, you may think that Nevi'us was only given to individuals. Like, there was a certain number of Nevi'im. There was the Abbas, Noach, there was the Abbas, and there was the Mors, and then there was the Shvatim, and so on, the Bnei Yaakov, the Bnei Yisrael, and then there were Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron, and then there was the Nevi'im, then later on the Rishonim, Achronim. You may think that Nevi'us was something which is vouchsafed to specific individuals. This is a very big mistake. Because I once seen it written, that in the time of the Nevi'im, I forget actually which particular time, Nevi'im, Rishonim, and Achronim, that over 1 million Jews were Nevi'im. It's a staggering thought. 1 million people were all Zichdim Adei Nevi'im. Could you imagine 1 million people walking around who were all Nevi'im? I mean, forget about Tzaddikim. A Navi is far beyond the Tzaddik. A Navi is beyond the Kodesh. He is a Kodesh, but the Kodesh worked out. And over 1 million Jews were Nevi'im. And the level of Kedusha of Klal Yisrael was awesome. And Nevi'us was given to Klal Yisrael, which means that fundamentally a way of knowing, a certain input of das was given to Klal Yisrael, which is l'mayla medech hateva. And this was norm. This was a standard for Yidden. You see, that's what we mean by Gilu level. You see, the Gilu of Ruchnius, or the Gilu of the Baruch Shalom, was on a very high madrega in those days. Because the Gilu of Ruchnius was known to Nevi'us. This is one important feature of Klal Yisrael before Purim, or Anshe Knesset Gedola, from the time of B'riyas Olam. Now, correspondingly, there was also Chochmas that had to do with the Satan. There was what's called Kishuv. What was that in Kishuv? Kishuv is a certain Chochmah, it's a certain understanding, it's an ability to understand certain basic mechanics of how the Satan operates, and the ability to manipulate the Satan, or at least certain, the Malachim which are given over to the Satan, called the Malcha Havolah. That's called Kishuv. Now, in the Torah says that Kishuv is Osa. Why is Kishuv Osa? Because Kishuv is very dangerous. Kishuv is a Chochmah where if you know, for example, certain shemus of the Malach HaChavolah, you can call them down and force them to do what you want done. Therefore, you can actually manipulate the tremendous potent forces which is at the behest of the Satan himself, and you can use these in the world itself to get whatever desires you want. That was what Kishuv is. You can bring down neshamas and you can force neshamas. It's not so poshut. You see, you can bring like Eivot and Shovot and Shmuel and Navi. I mean, through certain kirks and the Kishuv and Yidonim and so on, these were very powerful forces. that were extremely powerful, that Malachim Kedushim also many times are caught in that sense. But Kishuv was also available. The knowledge of Kishuv was known in the world. It's very known, for example, that the ancient Egyptians were all being Machashrim. It's a Gemara Kedushin. Tisha Kabin, when Kishuv was given the world, the Egyptians took 9/10. The Assyrians were known Machashrim. Amalek was known to be Machashrim. They knew how to figure out the stars. The Babylonians were known Machashrim. The ancient Egyptians, many of the ancient cultures knew the Chochmah of Kishuv. They knew it clearly. Even though we in the world today, historians tend to call them backwards, primitive people. You see, this is a very big mistake. They were aware of different chokhmas that are no longer known today. They knew the chokhmah of astrology. They knew how the hashkocha manifested itself in the signs of the heavens. They knew the koyach of kishuv, how to manipulate the koyach of tumah and the koyach of Satan to achieve their own end, as you clearly saw by Mitzrayim. You see, they knew the chokhmah hayad. Many things they understood, and they still understood how to do. So corresponding to the chokhmah, to the koyach of nevuah, was also the chokhmah of kishuv. Now, what's wrong with Kishuv? What's wrong if you manipulate the koyach of tumah? Well, fundamentally, what's bad with it is that just like Nevi'as, in order to achieve the koyach of Kedusha Nevi'as, means that you have to establish a state of dveikus with the Kedusha, and then after you establish the state of dveikus, you see what I'm saying? Then you are zercha to the das that comes in Nevuah. In order to be a machashev, you have to become dovek to the tumah first. It means you have to give over your neshama to the koyach of Yunika, the ashpor, total tumah. You see, and once you allow this to enter your being, then you're able to use the chokhmah of Kishuv. Now, that's a very dangerous thing to do it, because fundamentally in doing that, you're taking klippas onto you, and you're holding on to them. You're almost being ma'abed nefesh. You see. But it doesn't think. The point is, but Kishuv itself is a tremendous level of gilui. This is what's important. Just like Nevi'as, you see, the koyach of Nevi'as establishes a very high level of gilui in terms of ruchnius, right? Kishuv also does that. Because when a person is machashiv, when you see a machashiv operating, that's a tremendous hakora of the koyach of the Bnei Shalom. You see, and of ruchnius itself. You see, it's an ability, you see, Nevuah and Kishuv are both abilities to go into the panemius of the koyach of the Bria and use them. You see, its ability to lock in to the very forces of the Bria, the Kedusha and Tumah of the Bria, and use them in different ways, which means that the evidence or the existence of these forces are plain for everyone to see. Now, in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu was a Navi that was able to sustain that level of awareness without going to sleep. But in order to do that, obviously it was a very powerful neshama that he had in order to sustain that kind of consciousness in that way. But what we're saying is that the existence of Nevuah, the existence of Kishuv, shows that the generation is on a much higher level of Gilui than without it. Now, at those times also, there was another important feature. They were at the Yetzer of Avodah Zarah. Now, the Yetzer of Avodah Zarah is an instant Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer of Avodah Zarah can only come to a very high neshama. Because fundamentally, what is the drive of Avodah Zarah? The drive of Avodah Zarah is a drive for ruchnius. It's a direct drive for ruchnius. We'll examine that later on more carefully when we go into the Chet of Adam Rishon specifically. But what Avodah Zarah is fundamentally, it's much higher, let's say, than Arias. Arias or Ritzicha. The three big Averis was what? Avodah Zarah, Shlichus Damim, and Gilu Arias. Gilu Arias is a taiva. It's fundamentally a taiva. You see, Shlichus Damim, killing another person, is a power aspect, but it's also a level of power that a person has that he controls someone else's life. You see, Avodah Zarah is not so much a power or a taivatic aspect; it's an aspect of dveikus. It's a desire to be mizdabek to a certain level of ruchnius. That's what Avodah Zarah is. Except that Avodah Zarah through the Yetzer Hara is a desire to mizdabek to a Yetzer Hara, to these ruchnius that's shaykh to the Satan. This is the thing. But the Yetzer of Avodah Zarah can only come to a very high neshama. What do we mean? All of our neshamas today feel a desire for taivas. We have no problem with Gilu Arias. You see, many people today have no problem with Shlichus Damim. But there's no one today that wants to really be in Avodah Zarah as such. Why? Because on Avodah Zarah, the Yetzer of Avodah Zarah means desire of a person to be mizdabek to ruchnius. Now that kind of a drive is a fundamental direct drive that comes from the neshama itself. You know what I mean? The desire to mizdabi to ruchnius or to an elikus is a very hard thing that emanates from a direct neshama. Except that avodah zorah means that drive to be mizdabi to ruchnius is seduced by the Satan. So what happens is the person therefore is mizdabik to ruchnius that has to do with the Satan, with the kochas of tumah. You see, that's why Kishin or Avodah Zorah was always very much interrelated. That's the meaning of Avodah Zorah. Avodah Zorah, the desire for Avodah Zorah represents a very high drive of the neshama itself, except that the Yetzer is able to convince this drive of the neshama itself to be dovid to the ruchnius that has shaykhs with the Yetzer Hara. You see, that's Avodah Zorah. Be dovid to the Satan. Be dovid to the God, or to the Elokim, the Yeshua Mavadeh, which has shaykhs to the kochas of tumah. Now, the only way Avodah Zorah can come to neshama is that neshama also shaykhs to kedusha. You see, in that case, that drive attempts to mizdabek to the bonishom, to the Ein Mavadeh. You see, so that's the thing. The Yetzer of Avodah Zorah would never exist if there wasn't a Yetzer Tov for Nevi'us, or for the Vei'hais Vegas. One is Zelu Mazeh. Once the neshama has shaykhs to these kinds of drives, when a person feels inwardly that he wants to connect himself to high levels of ruchnius, of elokus, so the Yetzer Torah tries to make that drive one to connect himself to the Baruch Shalom, Einod Mavadoi, you see. And the Yetzer Hara tries to give that drive one over the kochas tumah, so the person should be dovid to the kochas tumah or to Avodah Zorah itself. In today's world, you don't find it anymore. Adrabah, a large percentage of today's world are totally atheistic. They have no shaykhs to any union of elokus. You see, atheism did not exist in those days. In those days, either you had Yidden or you had Avodah Zorah. That's what you had. If you notice, there was no atheism in those days. Why? Because the neshamas of all the people who lived in ancient times had no shaykhs to atheism. Because the neshamas at that time were on such high levels that the neshama itself wanted to be mizdabek to ruchnius automatically. Except that the direction of ruchnius depended on either the Yetzer or the Yetzer Tov. You see, the Yetzer and the Yetzer Tov would direct the inherent drive of ruchnius from the neshama in one of two directions. But the neshamas were so high that there was a specific drive for elokus that existed in those people at that time. After the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, that was removed because the neshamas went down. So the neshamas no longer manifested openly the drive for ruchnius. That's why much later on you can have the union of atheism come into the world. Much later on, in that sense. So therefore, the presence of Avodah Zorah in the world shows the presence of very high, powerful neshamas. And those high, powerful neshamas show the presence of the possibility of Kishuv and Nevuah. You see, that's the thing they all have in common. Nevuah, Kishuv, and the presence of Avodah Zorah all show what? They all show the existence that the neshamas of the people at that time were very high. They were very powerful in kedusha, from a qualitative sense. You see, the neshamas were very great in terms of kedusha. They had very high levels of kedusha from birth, from their kochas nefesh. Therefore, automatically, those people were able to relate to ma'asim, to events, to phenomena that were normally connected with very high levels of gilui, nevi'us, kishuv, avodah zarah. Now we have a fourth important characteristic, which is Nisim Niglim. Whenever the Banishim gave Yeshua to Klal Yisrael, or to the other people at that time, he many times would overturn the Bria with a nest, right? But those Nisim were open. They were Nisim Niglim. They were revealed Nisim. Now when you see an open revealed nest, like by Avram, by the Kibshin Eish, and Yitzchak and Yaakov and so on, and you see it by Yetzias Mitzrayim, and you see by Yeshua, and many of the Nisim that keep on going Midoach Hador, you see, or by Chizkiah, when the entire Syrian army was wiped out in one night. When you see many Nisim constantly, this is a tremendous gilui of ruchnius. You see, why is it that the Nisim or the Yeshuas of Klal Yisrael that took place during those days in ancient times, the 4 Purim, were all of a level of open revelation? Why? Because the neshamas were very powerful, and because they were very powerful, all the neshamas, they were able to tolerate very high levels of kedusha at that time. The Beit HaMikdash existed then. Right? And in the first Beit HaMikdash, there were many Nisim. There was the Batum, there was the Indian of what he called the Oren, there were many open Nisim in the Beit HaMikdash. So Klal Yisrael was constantly surrounded by open Nisim. either in the Beis HaMikdash, which they came up 3 times a year, or in general in the Yeshuas that the Baruch was spoiled for them. They were constantly open nisim that they saw. Because this all indicates a very important concept. The neshamas of people at that time, before the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, were very great. The kedusha of those neshamas were very great, and therefore the koach nefesh of those neshamas, not only of the Jews but also of the goyim. Therefore, now you may say, well, if the Baruch therefore was Megala so much ruchnis at times, through Nevuah, through Kishuv, through Nisim Niglam, right? And all these things, what kind of bechira did those people have? The answer is that just like they were given tremendous Kedusha to withstand, the hasogas of the Kedusha, they were also given tremendous Yetzaharas on the other side, you see. If there was Nevi'us, there was Kishuv, you see. If there was a Beis HaMikdash, with all this tremendous amount of Nisim that goes on, there was Avodah Zorah, there was the Yetzer of Avodah Zorah. Just like the Yetzer Torah was able to manipulate very powerful neshamas of Kedusha, the Yetzer Hara was able to manipulate very powerful koichas of Tumah. You see. But what they both have in common was that the world from the time of Adam Rishon till the time of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah and the Ma'aseh Purim was in a very high madrega, B'dag HaNevuah, B'dag HaNisim Niglam. You see. That means that the people there were much more locked into the pneumius of the forces of the Bria, of Kedusha and Tumah. Now, even though the people at that time were locked into this kind of madrega, the Gila level was very high, it wasn't high all the time, you see. But obviously from the time of Adam Rishon before the Chet, because the time of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, this kept on going downhill, you see. The Nevi'im that lived in later times were not as great as the Nevi'im that lived in the time before. Everything kept on changing in what's called a continuum, you see. The world started off in an incredible high level of Giloi and kept on going down, down, down. But from the time of Adam Rishon to the time of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah and the Ma'aseh Purim, you see, what was common to all of them was the fact that the world existed in the mode of Nevuah, in the mode of Kedusha Yesera. So that the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Torah both partook of this Kedusha Yesera in order to bring the person to either a concept of Yeshua Mavado or Eino Mavado. What happened by Purim? Purim changed the entire matter, and that's the whole meaning of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. The Anshe Knesset Gedolah saw that as the world kept on going further and further, the Bria would become transmuted into a different format. And that by the Ma'aseh Purim was the first Ma'aseh that we saw. That's why she's called Esther. And the Ma'aseh Hester. In other words, no longer would the neshamas of Klal Yisrael be so great that they can have such powerful levels of Kedusha, but rather they would go downhill. And the world would no longer have the Gilui of Nevuah, it would now have the Gilui of Chochmah, which is a different parameter, it's a different mode, it's a new kind of criteria. Let's examine now this new mode called Chochmah. Well, first of all, Chochmah is a different kind of understanding of the world. It's an understanding of the world not through its inner forces, directly, but it's an understanding of the world through its outer forces, through the minute details of the world. And that's why we see that by the time of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, speculative philosophy, Greek philosophy started. Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, they were at that time. The emergence of Greek thought, which is the fundamental basis, the thought of all science and technology which came later on, started at that time of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. That's when it was in its heyday. It was the ability to look at the world through Chochmah, by understanding it. How? Through observation, through inference, through logical deduction, an understanding of the details, the plotum of the Bria. That's the meaning of Chochmah. Nevuah is a different thing, or Kishuv is a totally different thing. In Nevuah, one understands not the details, the plotum of the Bria, but he understands the klolim of the Bria. He understands the fundamental principles, the inner forces. He doesn't necessarily know the plotum. A Navi does not know the plotum. He understands the klolim, you see. He understands a Navi, or people at that time understand they can make a person alive because they can use certain shemus. But they did not know necessarily what all the physiology and anatomy of a body is. They could not understand exactly molecular biology and all the specific scientific details of what constitutes in the body. But what they did understand, they understood the fundamental life force of a human body. Let's see. They understand how to put a life force like that inside and create life. You see, and create a golem, for example. So the fundamental criteria of Nevuah is its ability to understand the klolim and the pneumius of the forces, but not the protum, or not the details. Chokhmah is not like that. Chokhmah is an ability to understand the chitzonius, or the protum of the situation, you see, and only slowly work your way back to understand the klolim, you see. But you cannot jump quickly and understand the klolim, because you're not in contact with the inner forces of the Bria. You're in contact with the myriad and billions of details of the outer manifestation of the Bria, as it presents itself phenomenologically. You see, Chokhmah is involved with studying the phenomena of the world in terms of all their manifestations, but not the inner forces. It uses observation, logic, and all deduction of whether inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning. All the basic forces of concept and logic and inference are used in Chokhmah. And man slowly builds up an understanding of how the world works. How the world works in terms of its phenomena and basic forces about it. But it does not lead the person to understand how the world works in terms of its pneumius or its ruchnistic inside. You see? Hence what you find as the world changes over from a dag of Nevuah to a dag of Chokhmah, that the very way men understand the Bria, the Hasoga, the Das of the Min Anushi changed. That the Das of the Min Anushi, according to the parameter, the mode of Chokhmah, is one of logic and influence, of scientific method. You see, this is what happened. Hence, proliferation of Chokhmah Sateva, science, physics. You see, Chokhmah Sateva became known in those days. Starting with Aristotle and going on to Archimedes and so on, and then into the scientific revolution itself. What used to be Kishul, or the ability to manipulate reality by manipulating the internal forces of Riyat-Ruchnius, now you have to manipulate reality by understanding its phenomena, you see. You can hear another person, talk, because you have a telephone in your hand, right? But a telephone is a device which is created from Chokhmah. You see, it's a device which is created from the principles of what? Of electromagnetic radiation, you see, and amplification, and so on and so forth. All the principles of electricity and so on, based on the theory of the atom. But it's not an ability to hear someone else 1,000 miles away because of Nevuah, that you can almost hear what he's saying from Nevuah, because you're able to penetrate into the ruchnistic of the Bria. You see? This is what Chazal mean. From here you can understand a very important thing. There are two things in Chazal which they call Ma'aseh Makova and Ma'aseh Bereshis. Ma'aseh Makova is the Chokhmah, or the understanding of the ruchnius of the Bria. How the world was created in terms of the fundamental inner forces of ruchnius from the Banishim himself down to the level of Olam Hazeh. Ma'aseh Bereshis is different. Ma'aseh Bereshis is the understanding of the immediate ruchnius which went to create Olam Hazeh, or the Olam Asiyah, this world that we see. Now many people confuse Ma'aseh Bereshis with physics, or the sciences of today. And there's a very big difference between the science of today and what Chazal call Ma'aseh Makova. Ma'aseh Bereshis. Ma'aseh Bereshis is to understand the pneumistic or the ruchnius behind Teva. That's what it is. Science is the ability to understand the chitzonius or the phenomena of Teva without understanding its ruchnius. That's why in many cases in the Gemara you'll find the Chazal saying things of Ma'aseh Bereshis that make no sense from science. For example, Chazal would say that the sun goes around the earth. You see, that there's a machlokes between the Yevonim and the Klal Yisrael, the Chachmei Klal Yisrael, on who goes around who. And Klal Yisrael held, and the Yidden held, the Chachamim held, Chazal held that the sun goes around the earth. They weren't talking about the science of astronomy. They weren't talking about the science phenomenologically, what appears to be true. They were talking about the ruchniistic wise, in terms of astrologically. In other words, the kurchs of ruchnius manifest themselves in such a way where the sun, it's כאילו the sun goes around the earth, not vice versa. Because that's how the hashgacha process works. So all the statements that are said in Gemara, which we don't really understand because they seem to contradict science, really only contradict the phenomenological aspect of science. Because those statements don't refer to phenomena. They refer to the inner ruchnius of what runs the Bria, or Teva. That's what Ma'aseh Bereshis is. Ma'aseh Makova is somewhat different. Ma'aseh Makova is the understanding of the fundamental mechanisms which run the upper worlds. You see, all the Elohim and the Malachim and the spheres and the things which are used to create everything. That's Ma'aseh Makova. But Ma'aseh Bereshis refers to the Chokhmah Hateva in its ruchnistic aspect. science and technology is concerned with Chochmas HaTeva in its Gashmistic aspect. That's why all the statements that you see in Gemara about Ma'aser Bereishis, about the Indian of science, is not science. It's not Chochmas HaTeva. It doesn't refer to physics and astronomy. It refers to Ma'aser Bereishis, which is the physics and astronomy of Ruchnius of the Bria. Now, after Anshe Knesset Gedolah, the world shifted to a world of Chochmah, to a world of technology, a different way of approaching the Bria, to Tlotim. And also, Avodah Zarah left the world, obviously, because no longer the Neshama so high, the Neshama no longer had that direct drive for Ruchnius anymore. And finally, all the Nisim that Klal Yisrael saw after the Ma'aser Purim were all Hester, Nes Nista. The whole Ma'aser Purim, what was the Ma'aser Purim? If you look at the entire Ma'aser Purim, can you see one Nes? No, the entire thing looks like some kind of innocent story, a series of coincidences. Because what the Baruch said, decided that after the Ma'aser Purim, he decided that he would now work for Hester, which means that the Yeshuas and the Nisim would always go for Hester, unrecognizable.
Why?
Because the world was no longer Zeicha. The world was no longer Zeicha to open to a higher level of Kedusha because of the Chatoim. As man sins more and more, he loses his connection to Kedusha, and he goes further and further away. So when man has a certain Shaykh to Kedusha, you see, and he maintains a certain level, so his Nisyonos on a much higher level of Kedusha, Nevi'as, Kishuv, Avodah Zarah, and so on. But as man loses this because of his Chatoim, then the Tumah goes in the Bria. As the Tumah goes in the Bria more and more, you see, then the Kedusha becomes covered up, and the Neshamas become smaller. So because of that, man can no longer become involved in the Nisoyan that has to do with high levels of Kedusha, but even with low levels of Kedusha. So therefore he becomes involved in the Nisoyan of Chochmah, and the Nisoyan of Arayah is no longer Avodah Zarah, and the Nisim are no longer obvious in that kind of sense. Purim took place right after the Churban Bayis Rishon. The Churban Bayis Rishon and the Anshe Knesset Gedolah which lived at that time were the last of the Nevi'im. Haggai, Malachi, and Zechariah were the last of the Nevi'im. After those Nevi'im, there was no longer Nevi'is in the world. The Nisim that we saw in the Beit HaMikdash all disappeared with the first one. In other words, as Klal Yisrael went into a new Tkufa of the second Beit HaMikdash, it would now have to deal with a new mode of Nesoyim. No longer the mode of Ruchnius in terms of high level of Kedusha, but the mode of low level of Kedusha through Chachma. And this all took place in the time of Purim. And fundamentally, the time of Purim indicates a transition of the world in terms of the daga of the Nesoyan as the Gilu level. The Gilu level of the world was much higher because the fundamental Nesoyan dealt with higher levels of Kedusha. And then after the Ma'aser Purim, the world dealt with a lower Gilu level, so that finally the Nesoyan had to involve other parameters, other aspects besides these higher levels, like Chochmah. No longer did they have Avodah Zarah. No longer did Yeshuas come from Nisim Niglam, but Nisim Nistam. And the truth of the matter is, it's a continuum from there also. Because as Klal Yisrael go further and further from the first Beit HaMikdash, and later on they went into Golus, right? When the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, then what happened is, it was more Nespashit. The Hester became greater and greater. So there was a continuum the other way. So we find a very interesting thing. We find that from the beginning of the world until Purim, the world was in the mode of Nevuah. From Purim to the end of the Kates, the world is in the mode of Chachmah. Those are the fundamental modes. However, the entire thing runs on a continuum. As you go further and further away from the Bria Seilim, right, the modes get weaker and weaker in that kind of sense. What happens is that the Nevi'im get schwacher and schwacher, so that the Nevi'im Rishonim were much more in contact with the Pnimius of the Bria than the Nevi'im Acharonim. The Nevi'im Acharonim already were distant from the Ruchnius of the Pnimius Koach of the Bria. It's the same thing. However, with Chochmah you find it Puntverkehrt. As the world starts from Modern Rishon to the end of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, the Dark of the Nevi'is or the mode of the Nevi'is descends in Madrega. But as the world then transfers over to the mode of Chachmah, it begins to ascend. It begins to go up. So here you see that with the removal or the transition of mode, the direction becomes inverse to the original direction. Up to now, fundamentally, we discussed the two different modes. We talked about a Bria in the mode of Nevuah, and a world which is the mode of Chochmah. And we understand the fundamental features of both. In the mode of Neviah, you have a much higher Gila level. You have Nevuah, you have Kishuv, you have Nisim, which are open Nisim, you have the Yetzer Avodah Zarah, much higher Nisyonis that have to be Kedusha. In the mode of Chachma, it's on a lower level of Gilui. You only have Chachma, and you don't have any Yetzer Avodah Zarah anymore, you don't have any Kishuv anymore, you have instead Chachma Zateva. In that sense, you don't have any, the Nisim are all Nista, so you don't have that kind of thing. Now let's examine more closely the contrast between the mode of Nevuah and the mode of Chachma. We said very clearly that as long as the mode of Nevuah, you see, is the functioning mode, which means up to the time of the Anti-Knesset Gedolah, the functional mode was the mode of Nevuah, then what happens is it descends. From the time of Adam Rishon Achrachet to the time of the Anti-Knesset Gedolah, the Nevuah fundamentally descends. And the only reason why it went up with Moshe Rabbeinu, because the world was zircha to come out of Gula Shlema. That's why it went up. But normally, in many cases, it descends. In that sense. The Kedusha descends. However, when the world shifted to a mode of Chachma, we find that the reverse takes place. It begins to go up. So that the Chachma, which the ancient Greeks knew, was much smaller than the Chachma which we know today. You see, except for a slight lull in the Dark Ages, fundamentally, Chokhmah has been expanded tremendously. And you find, especially in the last couple hundred years, the Chokhmah is incredible in terms of what we know today, in that sense. So the question is, why is it that as the world goes on, in the mode of Nevuah, the Gilu level descends, whereas the mode of Chokhmah, it ascends? Well, it has to do with the concept of the Tigbur Surah. As man sins, what happens? The Yetzer gets bigger and bigger and bigger. As he gets bigger and bigger, there's a greater Yesh Oid Mavadoy or Hester in the Bria. And the Hester has a different application to Nevuah as it has to Chokhmah. As it applies to Nevuah, the more Nevuah you have, the more Gilu you have. The less Nevuah you have, the more Hester. Hence, in order to establish greater and greater levels of Hester, you have to establish lower and lower degrees of Nevuah. You see. However, in Chokhmah it's the reverse. The more Chokhmah you have, the more Hester you have. Because Chokhmah is something which is produced by the mind of man. So therefore it's stimulated by the Gaiva. Nevuah is produced from the outside. So a person always knows it's coming from the outside as such. The Chokhmah is something which produces by his own inferential logical processes. So as such, the more Chokhmah he obtains, the more Yeshua Mavadoy, the more Hester. The less Chokhmah, the less Yeshua Mavadoy. So therefore, if the world has to go on now in a mode of Chokhmah, it's going to have to increase in Chokhmah in order to give a greater level of Hester, not decrease. So therefore, the principle of Hester as it applies to Nevuah is to go down in Nevuah. But the principle of Hester as it applies to Chokhmah is to go up in Chokhmah. It's exactly the reverse. So that's why we find that the Bria is getting smarter and smarter as we get closer and closer to the case. Thus we understand why the movement of Nevuah in history is always down to accomplish greater Hester, but the movement of Chokhmah is always up to accomplish greater Hester, in that sense. That's why we in this generation are extremely so far from Nevuah. We are, in this generation, we are the farthest from understanding the pneumis of the Bria. That's why there's atheism now. Atheism represents something which is on the opposite side of Nevuah. It's a total absence of Nevuah. Kishuv is not an absence of Nevuah. Kishuv is a corresponding, you see, level of Nevuah also in the sense that it's a corresponding level of Gilui. But the total opposite in terms of a Hester from Nevuah is atheism, which says there is no Ruchnius. You see. This generation therefore is the highest, the lowest level of Nevuah in the sense that not only did Nevuah end at the time of the Anti-Knesset Gedolah, but any shaycha to the pneumis of the Bria is already gone. So that the world can now be, and that many people in the world can now be, in Russia and China, can be atheists. Where they have no shaycha to Kedusha at all anymore, in that sense. There's no shaycha to the Hakol of Ruchnis anymore. But in Chokhmah, the world has expanded tremendously. So what we have, therefore, the world has gone away to the total opposite pole in terms of Nevuah, and has gone to the total other end in terms of Chokhmah. So we have the biggest Chachamim today, and the biggest atheists at the same time. Both reinforcing the notion of Hester Yehuda. Chokhmah leads to the notion of Koich v'yotzim yodi. I am the one who's responsible for this. With my intelligence and my manipulation, I can control the reality the way I want. The more Chokhmah I have, the greater ability to say Koich v'yotzim yodi. Obviously, somebody who can simply make a certain electronic device is in a much lower madrega of Yeshod Mavadoi than someone who can put a man on the moon. Or somebody can put a heart transplant, in that sense. The more chokhmah, the more technology, the more hester, the more Yeshod Mavadoi, in that sense. But in order to accomplish that, you also have to be further away from the paninius of the Bria, from the hakor of Ruchnius. And that's the meaning of Nevuah. Nevuah represents the mode of Nevuah, or the feature called Nevuah, is the ability to recognize the existence of Ruchnius or not, in terms of its direct experience. That's what Nevuah means. When the world was filled with Nevuah, men were capable of directly experiencing Ruchnius. In a world where it's totally absence of Nevuah, only then is atheism shayach, because men cannot experience Ruchnistik at all. That's the meaning of Nevuah. The meaning of Chokhmah is something else. The meaning of Chokhmah is the ability to understand the Bria in one's own terms, you see. And thus, the more Chokhmah that there is, then it's possible to believe in the Yeshod Mavadoi. But in order for the world to reach its highest level of Hester, it has to be completely devoid of experience in Ruchnius and reach a very high level of Chokhmah. Maximum Chokhmah and zero Nevuah bring the world to the greatest level of Hester.
Does that explain?
Where is all this information leading us fundamentally? It would seem, and this is the thing, it would seem the fact that there was a transition in human history from the mode of Nevuah, which is a much higher level of Gilui, to the mode of Chokhmah, which is a lower level of Gilui, right? It would seem, very strangely, that the world is descending tremendously in levels of Gilui, isn't it? And we're going further and further away from the pnimis of the Bria, correct? No, incorrect. Because this is where the Hanogas HaYichud takes its place. It's very critical to understand the essence of Nevuah here. Nevuah, and all the krechot that come with it, is a way of being mizdabek to Kedusha. When you're mizdabek Kedusha, you begin to know tremendous things, and you have experiences that come because of a direct connection to Ruchnius. It's experiential. It's not cognitive. It's not knowing about Kedusha, it's feeling Kedusha, it's experiencing Kedusha. Chokhmah is not an means of experiencing Kedusha at all, it's cognitive. You see, it's knowing about Kedusha and knowing about Ruchnius without really experiencing it. You may think that Chokhmah is lower than Nevuah. In a sense it is, and in a sense it's higher than Nevuah. Why? Nevuah puts you in contact with the essence of the matter. It puts you in contact with the Ruchnius itself. But that's all it fundamentally does. It simply puts you in contact with the Ruchnius itself, and therefore you have an absolute certainty about its existence. But you do not have a profound understanding of what it is. You see, it's an experience. And although it does give you a tremendous amount of information, because just the experience alone, you see, it does not really reveal its nature or the basic principles of what's involved in Kedusha or in the Hashkoch itself in that way. You see, Chokhmah is not like that. Chokhmah is the verse. Chokhmah does not put you in contact with the thing. You see, it doesn't put you in contact with Ruchnius, because all you see is the phenomena, the outer phenomena. However, what Chokhmah does put you in contact with is the mechanism and the details. You know how the Kedusha in Ruchnius manifests itself constantly in all its different manifestations. So, in other words, Nevuah puts you in contact with the klolim without knowing the protim, because it's a direct experience. But Chokhmah puts you in contact with the protim without knowing the klolim. Each has a mila and each has a chasam. Nevuah is in contact with the klolim, with the pnimis, with the potent Ruchnius to force themselves, but you do not understand necessarily deeply what these things are about, even though you may clearly know that they exist. In Chokhmah, you understand what they're about, but you're not clear about their existence as such, but theoretically what their machinations are and their mechanisms and so on. What does all this come to tell us? What all this comes to tell us the following: that true shleimus is not Nevuah and it's not Chokhmah. It's both. It's the marriage of both. Hatzogas Yechudoi is reached in its highest madrega, not by being a Navi, not by knowing Klolim alone, and not by knowing Protim alone, but by knowing the Klolim married with the Zivug with its Protim. When you understand all the Protim and how all the Protim connect in a unity, in a tremendous balance and harmony, and how they lead irrevocably down to the Klolim, and how all of it is an expression of the Yichud HaBorei. You are on the highest madrega of Hasagas Yichudei. You see, that's when Chazal say Chacham other than the Navi. Chacham is greater than the Navi. It means, in one sense, it means even though the Navi is in direct contact with the Ruchnius, but a Chacham understands the Indian much better than the Navi in that sense. Even though the Navi feels it better. But ultimate shleimus of Hasagas Yichudei, which will exist in Yemot Mashiach. In Yemot Mashiach, when men will reach the highest madrega of Hasagas Yichudei, right? That means they will reach a madrega where there's a shituf or a combination of Chochmah and Nevi'ah together. A Yemot Mashiach with the void of Chochmah is as empty as Yemot Mashiach devoid of Nevuah. In terms of Hasagas Yichudei, that means that any Yemot Mashiach which will come about must come about in the end, and it must produce a marriage of Nevuah and Chochmah together. That is the ultimate goal of the Yemot Mashiach, the marriage of Nevuah and Chochmah together. Which means that in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, had Moshe Rabbeinu brought the Gula Shleim at that time, then the emphasis, the main mode at that time would have been Nevuah. The world would have been devoid in its highest Madei of Chochmah. So that Yemot Mashiach would have been occupied with being mashling the Chochmah with the Nevuah together. You see? In other words, they would have understood the inner life vital forces of a man, but they would not understand clearly, necessarily, the Chochmah HaTeva, or the biological phenomena which clearly radiate out of the Ruchnius. Why there is a law of gravity, why the entire Bria looks like the Chochmah HaTeva the way it does, how it's a reflection of Tikkun Adam B'Tzufa is not clearly understood. Chochmah tells me that. Nevuah tells me that the world definitely exists for the Tikkun Adam B'Tzufa. But how the Chochmah HaTeva reflects the Tikkun Adam B'Tzufa, so that it's all a tremendous Yad HaBorei, it's a Yichud HaBorei, so that we see how the laws of physics themselves actually emanate from the Tikkun Adam B'Tzufa, of Hanagas HaMishpat. How the Hanagas HaMishpat was not only went about creating the fundamental forces of Kudush and Tum in the Bria, but how it also went about creating Olam Hazeh, and how Olam Hazeh, or the design of Olam Hazeh itself, actually reflects the ultimate tachas and the tikkun of the Bria itself. This can only be known through Chochmah. In the Yemot Mashiach, which will come about in the near, hopefully very soon, but in the Yemot Mashiach, which will come about as it nears the gates, when the door is Kula Chayavim, and the door has a tremendous amount of Chochmah, it means that the marriage has to take place the other way. That the world has to go back up to a madreg of Nevuah, in that sense. And there has to be a shituf of the Nevuah and the Chochmah in that point. The key idea that I'm saying is the following: that the Yemot Mashiach constitutes a generation which is Masi Yechudoi in a very, very powerful degree. You cannot have Shleimistik HaSogas Yechudoi unless you understand the Klorim and the Plotim. How Klorim and Plotim both together in their combinations reveal the Achdus HaBorei, the Einoid Mavadoi. You see, the fact that there's Yichud B'Mitziasoi, Yichud B'Shidasoi, Yichud B'Hanhagasoi. The entire Hashkoch of the Plotim and the entire design of the Bria reflects one Watson, one being, and one Hanhaga, and one objective. So therefore what we see is a very important thing, is that even though Chochmah is ascending and creates a greater level of Einoid, of Yeshud Mavado, of Hester, but ultimately the very ascension of Chochmah will bring us further and further to a higher level of Yemot Mashiach, in a certain sense, in that way. So the other idea which comes out is this, is that if the Yemot Mashiach occurs in different times, it has a different job to fulfill, depending on what if the Chasson is in that Yemot Mashiach. In a time when the generations are filled with Nevuah, then fundamentally Yemot Mashiach must be preoccupied in the Mashlim Da'asad Zechudoi, you see, through the union of Chochmah and the interaction of the two. But in a generation which is filled with Chochmah but devoid of Nevi'as, you see, then Yemot Mashiach must become preoccupied with filling the Chochmah to understand the union of Nevi'as as well, in that sense. So this is the difference between the Gula Rishon and the Gula Achorona, in that kind of sense. That even though they were both achieved, Yemot Mashiach, both of them achieved the aspect of Shleimus and Hasagas Yichudei Umorav Deis Hashem K'mayim Yom Chasem. You see, it still takes place in a different way. And from this we can begin to understand the avoid of the Mashiach ben Yosef in the end. Because fundamentally, the Inyan of Moshe Rabbeinu, which the Guru Rishona, which functioned in the mode of Nevuah, took place through the Mateh. The Mateh of Moshe brought on all the Nisim, the Makas of Mitzrayim, the Tis of Mitzrayim, and so on, and the Kriya Samsuk. That Mateh was an aspect of Nevuah in that sense, or an aspect of Nes Nigla. The Mashiach and Yosef ultimately will also have a Mateh. It'll be the same Mateh of Moshe, except that the Koyach of that Mateh will be different. That Mateh will be in the mode of Chochmah. And it's with Chochmah that the Mashiach ben Yosef will transform the world into an image of a Moraz Deis Hashem Kamayim Niyam Hashem. It's the mode of Tzur of a Chochmah, not in the Tzur of Nevuah, that this thing will be done. You see? And the Tzur of Chochmah is a very powerful Tzur. It's greater than the Tzur of Nevuah in a sense. Why? Because the Tzur of Nevuah brought the Hafsagat Yehuda Metoich Nes Nigla. But Nes Nigla is weaker. It's an eruption in Teva. Chochmah is an erosion of Teva. Because once a person understands the existence of the Baruch Shalom and the existence of the Tachlis of the Bria through understanding through Chochmah, then the Yetzer Hara can never come again and fool him. But if he understands it through a nest, because he saw the nest, well, as soon as the nest is gone, Teva's back. And once Teva's back, you see, then the Yetzer can come back in that kind of sense. But through Chochmah he cannot come back. Chochmah is more powerful in destroying the Raglayim or the feet of the Sitra Achra, more than Nes Nigla in that sense.